I'm Ellen Wartella. I run a center on media, technology, and human development at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And I hold appointments in a variety of disciplines here, but my home appointment is in the communication studies department. But I also have appointments in the medical school and in education and social policy and in psychology. How did I come to do research on children and the internet? And let me take an expansive view of the term children, because really right now I'm spending a lot of time with adolescents, kids 13 and older, but I've done work with younger kids. I have been doing research on children, media, and technology issues since I was in graduate school. So this has been the area that I consider the focus of all of my research. And historically and today, I began by doing research on TV advertising's influence on children when that was a really hot public policy issue in the United States. And so I think of my work as being at the nexus of public policy questions or public questions, developmental psychology, what we know about children and how they change over age and contents and contexts, and media or technology. So why am I studying internet and kids today? Well, because there are a lot of social issues and concerns that parents, policymakers, and others have, teachers, about how the internet, and in particular with adolescents, how social media is influencing the development, character, identity, social practices of adolescents today. Well, that's an interesting question, because I recently was asked to write a commentary on a monograph that's going to be coming out on the history of the direct effects model of media effects, going back to the pain fund studies in the 1920s in the United States, which looked at the effects of movies, which was the medium of the day, on youth. And I realized that when I was first read those studies, they had brought together the best social scientists of the day from a variety of disciplines, from economics, from sociology, from psychology. And they demonstrated, if you read all of the volumes, that no one discipline has a surfeit, has a corner on understanding a phenomenon. And as a consequence of that, as I've been reflecting to write this commentary, I realized that those studies had a profound effect on me, not just because of their findings, but because of their approach to studying the same sort of phenomenon that I've been interested in studying. So what kinds of backgrounds do I use? I have collaborated with computer scientists to understand technology better. I've collaborated with sociologists, with developmental psychologists, with other people in communication technology, HCI, human computer interaction. I collaborate across disciplines to try to understand the phenomenon that I'm looking at. No one discipline has a corner on understanding a phenomenon completely, and I try to look across disciplines that I think might be able to help me understand the policy questions, the public questions that I'm trying to pursue. Developmental psychology certainly has. I was training as a graduate student at the height of the grand theorists of the Piagets and Vygotskys. And in Minnesota, where I got my PhD, I was fortunate enough to take my introductory course to Piaget's theory from John Flavel, who went on to Stanford and was really one of the major American developmental psychologists who explained Piaget to American audiences. So I probably came out of graduate school with an appreciation in particular for Piaget. And so I've always had a developmental perspective. And later on, I came to understand that Vygotsky had an awful lot to offer to us as a Russian theoretician, because he was interested much more in that social context, which it became quite obvious to me that that was an important context. So in terms of theoreticians, those are the two. Now, somewhere in the 90s or so, grand theorizing became less popular in developmental psychology. And the attempt to try to shoehorn all of our studies into a particular theoretical perspective of one of these grand theorists became less popular. I think that my approach today is probably to draw from different disciplines, theoretical elements or concepts or approaches that seem to make sense to me for the phenomenon I'm studying. And if there's a rubric that I do think is useful, that perhaps has replaced grand theorizing and research on kids and technology, it's the rubric that to understand the phenomenon, we need to understand the child and how they differ across age, across social classes, across different contexts. The content of the technology that we're looking at. And I might add that content and technology, we need to look at both today. I think that some of the mobile technologies have affordances that previous technologies didn't have that may be important. I'm particularly concerned about the online environments, iPads and phones and accessing that, because these are technologies and platforms that have multiple uses, not just one kind of use. And the context. So the child, the content, and the context is the rubric that's used. What's the context of use? With whom are the children using it? How do they interact with others around the context? In what particular situations do these use this technology? So this rubric, which has been around for, I can't remember, at least 5 years, maybe 10 years, people have been talking about this rubric, is a rubric that I find useful. Absolutely draw heavily on developmental psych. That is my go-to place to understand, particularly since I'm interested in children of different ages and how they respond to things. I always take that kind of developmental perspective. And so, yes, if there is a theories that I use, it's an understanding out of developmental psych, not just the grand theory, but if there's a theoretical description of the development of a phenomenon. Right now, for instance, executive functioning, which is something that develops in late toddlerhood, early elementary years, and is important as kids get older, how executive functioning works to influence whether kids become aggressive or not, how they react as victims of aggression. So I do look at a literature that may take a concept and describe it, because I think it's important for the phenomenon that I'm studying. And yes, I'd say that if there's a discipline that I use more than any other, it's developmental science. I think that there's an acknowledgement today that didn't exist when I was starting to do my work as a graduate student. Developmental perspective wasn't really popular. I came into the field when the United States was studying TV violence, and there were very few studies in the original Surgeon General study of 1982 that had anything of a developmental perspective. Social learning theory really was adevelopmental, which was the main theory of the time, that the same model for effects of social learning occurred at all ages for all people, and there are some differences around that. So I think one thing that has definitely come into the field since I started is the acknowledgement that children of different ages respond to and use technology differently, and that the developmental perspective is an important perspective to take across disciplines. I think the second thing that's happening today is that so much of what we've looked at has historically been learning cognitive outcomes. And I think there's an increasing acknowledgement, certainly in the developmental psych literature, but I also think increasingly in communication studies, that social emotional learning, that outside of cognitive issues, is also terribly important. And particular as children age, the interaction between social emotional development and cognitive development is becoming much more obvious and of much more interest than it had been before. And I think that's a difference. I've come to an appreciation that the pediatric community has a very different perspective. The medical community has a different perspective from the social science community. And while in the past I have explored variations in the social science community, I think it's also important to understand the medical community, because technology is not just about children's learning and behavior. It does have implications for their well-being, and the medical community can have a better sense of how we look at well-being. So I find it interesting that over time I keep expanding where I want to go to try to understand a phenomenon. And it's been quite useful for me to open up my mind to looking at medical issues, as well as much more the social cognitive learning issues, psychological issues. I guess I'm really suspicious whenever I hear strong claims made about how technology is having strongly negative influences on children, and that it's somehow harming their development. And children are much more resilient than that. And technologies themselves, rarely is it the platform itself that has the technique, the effect. So whenever people say iPads have this effect, or television has this effect, what we know is you have to go beyond the technology itself to look at the content. And so I really get very suspicious and annoyed when I hear about television's effects, as opposed to what are we talking about? What sorts of content? What kind of issues are we raising? I guess that's the one thing that triggers me. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I'm also suspicious of a uniformity of belief in the strong direct effects model. I don't think we have in the history, recent history of studying kids and media and kids and technology, that we find uniformly strong influences. There are always moderators of that and variations of that. I usually start any project, whether it's an experiment or a survey I'm going to do, with focus groups, because I always learn from talking to the subjects that I'm eventually going to study, much more than I've learned from the literature of things that I want to ask. So there was a lot of discussion about social media being difficult for children, and that at adolescence, and that it was straining relationships, and that it may not have a really positive effect. So we ran some focus groups. And one of the things that I've discovered that was kind of interesting is that two things. First, that in the focus groups, one of the things I understood is there's been an increase in the United States of suicides among adolescents, going down to younger and younger ages. There's an increase in depression. This was even before the coronavirus. And so there seem to be some mental health issues, and there's a lot of discussion about the relationship. What did I learn in the focus groups, and which I'll be pursuing nationally, is the context of living as an adolescent in American society today is very difficult. I was shocked by, of the 65 students that we interviewed, fully a dozen had experienced friends who had committed suicide, or they knew who were severely depressed. The context of, and another 10 or so were in schools that had full-time police pursuing them in the school system, in their schools, because they were worried about violence. That is not the kind of context that I grew up in terms of schools, that the reality of their lives, irrespective of social media, is difficult. Being an adolescent is difficult, and the coronavirus has just made it even more difficult, would be my view. So that's the first thing I learned, that it isn't always the technology or the use that they're having, that you have to understand the wider context of what the reality is for the kids you're studying. The second thing I learned is that much of the popular discussions about social media in adolescence, for instance, is all about the older adolescents, and in particular the negative consequences. Are they going to run across pedophiles? Are they going to be subject to sexting that's going to pursue them when they try to apply for jobs or go to graduate school? How do they deal with cyberbullying? There are a number of negatives. I was struck in my conversations in these focus groups with a 13-year-old who said something most interesting to me that I hadn't thought of before, which was during the 2 hours of the focus group, she didn't say a word till the very end. Our last question was, is there anything that adults have wrong about social media in adolescence? And she finally said something, and she said, you'll notice that I haven't talked very much. I'm very, very shy. I have difficulty meeting people. And if I meet somebody online first through social media, then when I meet them in person, I have something to talk about, and it's enabled me to make more friends in the real world. We never hear that kind of story in the popular press. And I was struck by the fact that one has to look at positives and negatives, and that one has to try to pursue the whole range of implications of how technology influences children's health and development. What do we know about socially useful ways of using the internet for children of different ages? What do we know about how they may or may not be balanced out by negative ways? I think the early concern about addiction to internet use is a subject that they're like within the last 3 years, Common Sense Media did a review of some of that literature. I wasn't persuaded by it, although it still kind of lurks in the popular press. That I'd like to pursue that concept a little bit better and understand. I'm not saying that some kids aren't addicted, they probably are, but we need much better description of who is and who isn't and why not. And that may be a topic that I don't think that one's going to go away, frankly. I think that one will stay with us as technology use on the part of kids occupies more and more of their daytime life. It's what they do in schools. If they're staying home now, they're all on technology. And so they use it for entertainment, for information, for schooling. It is a large part of what they're doing. And so I think we do need to understand that phenomenon better of technology and not using technology when they do and when they don't. In fact, I suspect that given the context today of what we're living through and how, I'll give an example for me, I live alone. And so if, and for weeks on end in the spring, I wasn't in the presence of another human being except online. And for some children and some families, that may be the case today, and it may be the case in the future. And so how to cope with that? How can we help parents and teachers help children through that? And what impact does it have at different ages? You know, we really don't know. We really don't have the answers to a lot of those questions. So if anything, I think the social effects, not just the cognitive effects, but the social effects of technology use are becoming much more apparently of interest today because of the dominance of using technology. And that's a very different phenomenon. That's trying to understand the contemporary world that children are growing up in. Number one, no one discipline has the corner on the best understanding of children and technology issues. If anything, we really need to have a multidisciplinary approaches. Two, while we may draw on concepts from different theories, including the old grand theories of Piaget and Vygotsky, and Brunner, I should add, again, grand theorizing is probably not as useful today as to develop an understanding of phenomenon, conceptual development phenomenon. Third, I strongly believe we need to have a strong developmental perspective that children of different ages and children and adolescents react to things differently. We need to describe things in that sense. So I'm at heart a developmentalist. And I guess lastly, I would say it would be useful in the future that we study and explain not only dominant effects in our studies, but understand and pursue further those parts of the sample that are not showing dominant effects, to understand more fully the phenomena that we study. Those are my main takeaways.